Everyone, thank you for joining us today. This presentation is meant to focus around how do we get started with this digital transformation. So just kind of go through a little bit of what our agenda is. So, I'm going to introduce myself. I'll turn it around to Brian and Matt and kind of let them introduce themselves. And then I'm going to basically do an interview of Matt, asking him a number of questions around how they were implementing a building information modeling process and what they're using some of that data for. We'll then go into a presentation around talking about how do we get started doing this. And then in the end, we'll have kind of a Q&A session where we'll do our best to answer some of the questions that come up. So first thing, quick introduction to IMAGINiT Technologies and myself, and then I'll turn it around to Brian. IMAGINiT Technologies is a division of RAND Worldwide. We are the largest Autodesk partner in North America. We have a number of different partnerships, whether it be Autodesk, Archibus, Leica, Epic Games from a visualization perspective. And in my role here as an engagement engineer, I guess the easiest way to say that is I'm one of the Bobs from Office Space. So if you've ever seen that movie, I'm basically the guy that tries to help people understand the right tool at the right time on the right project. And then how do we get the data that's generated seamlessly into the format that other people need so they can consume it and use it. So Brian, a little bit about you.
Yes, Brian Tuffin, been with IMAGINiT for 18 years now. I am on Corey's team. My focus is on the AEC side of things, going from design, visualization, construction documents, construction processes, all the way to facilities management. So that's kind of where I'm coming from with this information. Matt, I'll turn it over to you for introduction.
All right, my name is Matt Pacheco. I'm from Sandia National Labs. I'm currently part of the CAD and BIM team, and we've been working on BIM and utilizing Revit for the last 20 years at Sandia. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Matt. Corey?
So I'm going to start by actually talking to Matt a little bit. So, Matt, I had a couple of questions to ask you about how you guys are using this. So, I threw them up on the screen, but let me just start with really asking you, where are you using it? What are the main things that you guys are doing with the model-based data? What are you using it for?
So we currently utilize our models for design and for construction, and then the long-term goal is to utilize them for maintenance and for facilities management in general. We're currently trying to make that connection between Maximo and Tririga and the models themselves.
And as you're trying to utilize that, what are some of the data types that are important to you?
Well, it revolves around the maintenance and what type of data they need to ensure that they're able to maintain the systems and the equipment, and or addition could be nameplate data, could be data associated with outages and what our electrical engineers and maintenance folks require to better understand an outage in regards to our electrical system, maybe the breakers and things that need to get exercised. In addition to that, we're also looking at the data to be utilized for space management, but we're not just there yet with that component.
And now comes the hard part. How are you getting all that data? Where's it coming from?
Currently, our AE partners are populating the data within our design models, and they're providing the data that we've requested via our standards and our templates as a deliverable with the record model. So all of the information that we're interested in that pertains to maintenance and space management and systems engineering. We've got those fields embedded in our templates, and we've got the documentation in our standards to identify that those are required fields that need to be populated, that in return at some point or another will make that connection to our other flagship applications where we've got all of our data, such as Maximo and Tririga.
Let me ask a follow-up to that one that's not up on the screen. Are you guys starting from just capital projects, or are you doing from a retrofit standpoint, doing any laser scanning or any existing condition capture of your existing facilities? How did you kind of start?
So from the get-go, when we started implementing BIM, we thought it made sense to apply it only to brand new buildings that were coming out of the ground, and simply because of the fact that we get to develop the plan set from scratch. And so we haven't applied it to any existing buildings. We haven't gone down the path of trying to convert existing 2D drawings or raster drawings into Revit. We do have a few hybrid approaches where we've piloted on additions to buildings. So where we've got half of the building in existing 2D content and raster, and then we've got the new addition in Revit. And so we've got two scenarios where we've done that. Those have both been pilot projects. We're trying to better understand the mix and match of that content and how we manage it going forward. It's been a little bit challenging thus far. So where we get an opportunity, we try to implement the use of Revit so that we can further learn the complications or the challenges, or how may we manage that information going forward. And so the two additions are still part of our learning experience.
So a little bit of a follow-up. Your Revit information that you're getting, your as-built conditions, who's working to maintain that? How are you keeping that information up to date, or are you keeping the Revit database as your central model up to date?
We are actually. Our BIMs are living BIMs, and so they're constantly in flux. There's things being deleted and added based on project designs and so forth. And so we have AE partners that not only generate and create the BIMs initially for design and then provide the record models, but based on our workflow, we also have a check-in, check-out process for project models that then get updated based on the project scope of work. And then we have a process for how those updates get back into our living central model. So we are managing and maintaining the BIMs at this point, and we're still learning how that effort comes together. So far, it's been on a small scale simply because the majority of our buildings are brand new and we haven't had to do that many small projects within them. But those are starting to ramp up now, and so is our management of the BIMs in general.
If you don't mind, can you give everybody kind of an idea of how many buildings, what volume it is that you guys are managing right now?
If I recall correctly, I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 buildings that are in Revit format currently, and we're only utilizing an architectural, an MEP, and a structural model for each of those. We have also implemented a fire model, a security model, and a space model in our most recent projects, in hopes of trying to better understand if it makes sense to break that information out from the existing MEP and architectural models. And so we're just expanding our piloting, if you will, of having the information readily available and accessible through other models, and what the challenges that may bring as a whole. So with each project, we try to implement something new, if you will, so that we can learn from it, and then capture lessons learned and so forth.
So, those lessons learned and what is the value so far? We talked a little bit about this yesterday. So, what have you seen so far, and what are you hoping to see in the future?
Well, we'd like our models to ultimately become the source of truth, where all that information is aggregated in one place. We'd also like the information to be available via Maximo or via Tririga, but there to be a real-time connection between the two. We realize and recognize that 3D visualization of spaces and buildings and areas in general are extremely helpful, not only for design and construction, but also for maintenance and safety and so forth. So someday we'd like the models to be part of the resource that people go to find out information about a particular building or the systems and the equipment.
And one more on here. So you mentioned, Tririga, you mentioned Maximo as integration pieces. Are there any additional other tools that you're looking to integrate the data from the models into or with?
Yeah, absolutely. A few years ago, probably 3 or 4 years ago, we were piloting the importing or the implementation of our Revit data within our Esri GIS platform. And so at some point or another, when that Esri and Revit integration, I guess, has a little bit more growth, we'll probably revisit that effort to see if it also makes sense to have that information available there within Esri. Now, one of the things that we've had to do along the way in order for it to work nicely with Esri, or at least for us to be able to populate our 2D campus with our 3D environment, was to ensure that our models were coordinately correct, so that they would land up in their physical geolocation as we would expect in a GIS. And so that was something we implemented probably about 7 or 8 years ago. And so we've gone back and we've updated all of our existing models to ensure that they are coordinately correct and geolocated. So that's part of our standards. That's part of our process with all BIMs going forward. So that way they fall in place on a map as expected.
Well, Matt, thank you for talking to us. I'm going to welcome you to interject in anything as I'm going down forward. So if you feel you want to say, hey, we're doing this, or this is how we're doing it as I'm going down through these slides, please keep yourself unmuted and feel free to jump in. Okay. So with that, talking with Matt, he made a number of good points around how his organization is utilizing and kind of consuming this data, as well as how they received it and kind of how they maintain it. So I want to talk a little bit about implementing building information modeling, or BIM as the acronym in the last 10 years has come to be known. There are 3 kind of main things that need to be put together in order to truly implement a model-based process. And the first one is really data. The second is your standards and your underlying processes, and the third is your people. So these all need to come together. They don't all necessarily need to come together exactly, but they need to overlap in some way. And once we get that overlap of them, then we can start utilizing that model data from a facilities and operations perspective. So how do we do that? Where do we start? How does a project like this really kind of get going? So it's really not as hard as everyone thinks. One of the main problems that organizations have when they start to take this on is they go too big too soon. So, the main thing that you really need to do with this is plan, understand and develop your standards, and understand what tools you need to implement and what data that you need to consume. So that takes me to 3 really kind of simple questions that I want you guys to remember as we go down through this presentation that will help you understand where to get started. And those questions are pretty basic. What data do you need? Okay.
Now,
How do you discover what data do you need? Who do you ask? Are you just using this from a facilities perspective? Are you using it for operation and maintenance? Are you using it for academic planning or something else along those lines? So you need to understand what data do you need. The next piece is, once you have that defined, how are you going to get it? You heard Matt talk about standards, delivery standards on their projects from the AE partners. You define well-developed architectural and construction delivery standards that detail out what you're expecting to receive at handover. Okay, there are a number of different ways beyond capital projects that you can collect this data. There's laser scanning, existing condition capture technologies now, where you can go out, scan a facility, and convert that to a model. And then once you have it, you need to understand, okay, how are we going to maintain it within our organization? Are we going to define long-term contracts with our AE partners in order to maintain these master model environments? Are we going to have the software ourselves and train our facility staff and our design staff to utilize this and maintain it ourselves? So these are kind of the 3 main questions that you need to think about when you're looking at some of these projects. Mr. Tuffin, you have anything to add?
Yeah, and how are we going to keep it up to date? That's really a key thing, along with who needs the data. Don't leave any team members out of this. You really want to be in contact with all the different departments, all the different leads that might need to leverage it. Keeping the data up to speed, really you need to think about what is going to be your central database. What is going to hold all that information? Is it going to be, like we heard from Matt, a Revit type database that all data is pumped into it and is kept live and up to date? Or are we going to use a data lake, a pool of data that everything pulls from to keep their information up to date? Next slide, Corey.
So, now we want to move to, okay, once we have this stuff, what are some of the things that, it's used for? So, mostly your AE partners are designing, in the most cases, it's kind of becoming a standard in operations and a standard in practice for design firms to utilize a model in their initial design, and for construction firms to turn that into a constructability model to construct your facility. But it has not really become a standard yet, getting there, for owners to start taking and accepting that model-based data and consuming it. So Brian's going to talk about a little bit of some of the uses of how a building information model is used kind of out in industry.
Yeah, as Corey mentioned, a building information model is pretty common practices to use it for construction documents. But we have all of this rich, intelligent model-based information that we can run finite analysis on. What's the efficiency? What's the airflow inside of the building? How much is it affecting the environment? What is the carbon footprint? Are we trying to reduce our energy use? Go green with these facilities. We can study these at a design level and work with you to meet your goals, your criteria, or mandates that you're having to meet on energy consumption.
So talk a little bit about, I mentioned standards in practice, standard in operation. So from an owner's perspective, what are you guys typically receiving at handover? This is a survey that was done in, I think, 2020. So it's a little bit old, but I don't expect the numbers to be too different today. So you see the building information / model over there is a little bit under 60. I expect that over the years to climb, and I expect the CAD drawings and the hard copies to reduce, but it's still not the largest of these bars. And the PDFs, or what I'm going to call is digital paper, is still the typical way of handover at the end of a project. So not all owners are really asking for the model as a deliverable. But if you're looking to start utilizing that data, that's one of the key things that you need to have, is asking for the model and understanding what information you need in the model for you to be able to use. So you're going to start requesting and receiving more building information models from your construction management firms, from your AE partners, and a little bit less on the flat 2D CAD drawings, hard copies, but you're always going to receive the PDFs. But if you have the model, you can generate your own PDFs from that particular model as needed, as opposed to back to a CM and saying, hey, I need this print, or I need this view of this section. So
it really boils down to your information. What information do you need? What is your execution plan? What are you mandating that your AEC firms, GCs, provide back to you as a deliverable of those as-built conditions?
And again, over the years, it's started to get more, as owners got more sophisticated in their use of the data. This BIM deliverable is going to just keep on increasing. So as we see more value in receiving the database in a model format and working within the model process and integrating that data with other systems from facilities and operations, you're just going to see that has provided the deliverable increase. So that's all great. You got the model, but do you know what you have? So this is a typical image of a floor plan. This could have been created, in 2D. It could have been created in 3D. You won't necessarily know. One of the main things that you need to think about is when you're receiving these models, you have to verify that they match your standards and they have the data inside them that are part of your deliverable contract. Are they sending you what you're asking for? So it could be a full model, it could be a hybrid component, as you heard Matt talk about a little bit before. It doesn't necessarily need to be 100% all modeled at the start. So you start with a renovation of an existing facility, you get that model data, you create the hybrid piece. So you start collecting that data over time. Very seldomly is it all done all at once.
One thing to add to this is BIM, building information modeling. A lot of people believe the modeling aspect is the most important. It is important, but it's really the information. At what level do you need things modeled at? That ladder that you're seeing back there in the corner, do we really need that much detail associated with it? Would metadata be more important than a higher level of detail? So all of this comes into play with what information are you receiving, and it should be included in your BIM execution plan of what you're requiring to be provided back to you.
And there are tools out there now, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they really didn't exist, but there are all kinds of tools out there now for running checks of these models against your standards and your data requirements. So you can take and receive a model and hand over and check that it matches your standards before you agree. You guys are the owners. You have control over what you get. And you just need to exert some of that control when it comes to making sure that your AE partners and your construction firms are delivering to you the types of data that you're requesting. So what are some of the things that you can use these things for? So once you have this data and you have the underlying model in an environment, the low-hanging fruit for utilizing this is really space management. A Revit model makes it very easy to understand spatial data, to understand, what this square footage is used for, what's in it, and how it can be scheduled, and all that data can be pulled out fairly seamlessly. You can create an underlying area tag in Revit and basically create a schedule of all areas associated with it and create essentially the color-coded image that I have on this slide. So this is kind of low-hanging fruit. This is something that can be done almost directly as soon as you receive an underlying Revit model.
Yeah, just to add to that, Corey, a lot of times, companies and organizations will build back that area to the departments, or there are department area requirements, lab area requirements. Are you leveraging volume calculations? All of this is all low-hanging fruit associated with it. Now, each one of these areas and departments are intelligent. They're parametric. They know what content, what equipment lives and exists inside of that room, inside of that department. What's really interesting, though, is how do we want to name and identify each piece of content? Corey?
So one of the next pieces that you can use this for, and this is a little bit harder, it takes a little bit more thought, is from an asset management perspective. So, space management, fairly simple. You tag the spaces and you go. Asset management gets a little bit more difficult in that the naming conventions and all that need to be very well defined and need to be mapped between the databases. So when you look at a Revit model, so to speak, a building information model, it is essentially a common data environment, an underlying database for all that parameter and property information that you have for all the underlying assets that are within the model. But you want to make sure that the naming conventions are correct. So whether you're working in a COBE spreadsheet process, or you're working with Archibus or Maximo or FM Systems or some other FM tool, or as was mentioned earlier, Esri and GIS, and you want to sync all this data together, the naming conventions are extremely important in making that happen. So you need to plan that is something that we want to do. Here's what our standards are. Here's what our naming conventions are going to be for this, so that when I move that data, whether it's via a direct push or a direct rewrite back and forth, or if you're just kicking it out to a spreadsheet and bringing it back in, that it goes in seamlessly.
And this is something that Matt mentioned earlier on in the interview process, having a template of standards so that we can get the right information. As you're looking here, you see kind of a spider web of content and information inside of here. Identifying what's important to you, wanting to be able to click on maybe a VAV box for maintenance, take it down, replace it. What rooms, what areas, what departments are going to be affected by it? Maybe it's not just a VAV box. Maybe I have to go all the way back to the air handling unit. Who do I need to notify that it's 110 degrees outside, it's going to be a little bit warmer inside? What impact does that have? Cataloging the information in a fashion to where it's readily accessible to your end user. Right? And
all this data can be linked with your work order systems, your IWMS systems, your ticketing systems. So if you can go into some of those systems, not only would you have the data for, okay, what's broken, but you can also have where it's at, the warranty information, as well as any part information or available parts that you have in your inventory that you should take with you before you go. So if you have some fairly large campuses, it might take 20 minutes in a golf cart to get from one area to the next. If you drive out there and you don't have the parts, you got to drive back and get it. This way you can take a look and say, okay, what's the common cause of this particular problem? I'm going to take that with me beforehand, because here's the parts list for what I would need. And then you just get that out of the warehouse and go and fix it there. So there's having access to the data gives you the ability to become a little bit more efficient in your everyday work and life. So one of the other things that this is becoming larger and larger with some of the underlying mandates that have come out with from the federal and state governments now in terms of, you know, carbon footprint and the AIA, you know, 30 for 30 zero emissions pieces that are out there. But you can utilize these models in an evaluation of the energy use within a given facility at a given time. Now, this has always been utilized, you know, from a design side. You know, as architects design the building, they'll use this to do sun studies and determine where they should put shades and kind of what's the best way to place this building on a particular site. But now that we have more of this data, we can use it in the true operations of that particular facility. So there's a number of different ways to utilize a model from an energy perspective. I'm going to let Brian talk a little bit about some of those.
Yeah, so even though the designers are using it to start to leverage light penetration throughout the building, solar and thermal gain based off of how it's located on a specific site or specific direction associated with, we can benchmark that and measure it back to what the actual consumption is. We have 20, 30 years of energy prices, energy consumption, weather patterns. So we can ideally identify what operation costs from a utility standpoint and utilities draw is going to be, so we can now plan for off-grid or zero emissions for these buildings.
So one of the key points that I've been pushing through this whole presentation is your data standards are critical to this process. It needs to be thought out and planned. You need to understand what are the naming conventions you want, what are the attribute information that you want associated with it within the model. How are you going to track that? And that needs to be spelled out in your architectural and construction delivery standards. You know, and Brian's mentioned a BIM execution plan. So for those that don't necessarily know what that is, you know, in the audience, a BIM execution plan is essentially a living document that details out the inclusions and exclusions of the model through the design and construction process. And, you know, the owners can write, you know, this is the execution plan, or they can ask for an architect to create one for you that will detail out exactly what you're expecting to receive when that design is finished. And, you know, these data standards are, for example, Matt was talking about integration with Esri. So understanding that you want the Revit model geolocated to this location as it's designed, it's much easier to do that in the beginning than it is, as Matt can probably tell you, to do it after the fact. So, you know, understanding how you're going to use these models and what information is there is the first and foremost thing that anyone who wants to start doing this type of process needs to really think about.
And keep in mind, this is going to be a living document. It's going to change. Your requirements are going to change over time. You're going to gather more information and start using it deeper and wider throughout your organization the more you use it. Okay, Corey?
So let's talk a little bit about how you can use this with other systems. So I mentioned Esri before. There's integrations out there between Revit models and GIS systems. What you're looking at here, there's a direct link between Revit models and Archibus. There's one between with Maximo. There's one with Tririga as well. So 10 years ago, you used to have to use a spreadsheet, you know, Kobe data sheets, something like this. It was an export and an import, and it wasn't necessarily a direct read-write. But we've gotten to the point where, as long as the standards are there, as the naming conventions match and all the mappings are correct, you can push and pull data back and forth between these systems pretty seamlessly now. And it's only going to get better over time. There are some additional tools coming out. I'm going to talk about one of them in a little bit, but that will help you classify this underlying data. So it doesn't need to be everything. It's only what you need or what that system needs to consume. So you can have the Revit model as the common data environment as the central location for, inside the building envelope. You can have a GIS system for outside with the building envelope sitting there. And then you can have a facilities management system or a work order system or some type of ticketing system that's pulling data from both sources. So we're essentially integrating multiple data sources through our naming conventions and standards so that people can consume this data without necessarily needing to go into an authoring tool like Revit or needing to have the knowledge to open up that model. We want to make it simple for them to access and consume the data through whatever system it is that they need to access it in. So where is it going? I'm going to let Brian talk a little bit about some of these.
Yeah, so a lot of people's minds are probably starting to go towards new construction. And that's definitely what Matt mentioned. They initially started out with new construction. With today's capabilities and technologies, I kind of want to lean you to new construction, definitely, but don't let that be the determining factor of whether you're not going to move to this. What you're looking at here is a Revit model or database that has been generated from gathering points, data from, you can see a point cloud there. We're only changing a small area. So we've gathered some data through scanning, Leica scanning capabilities, point clouds, through photogrammetry, things like Matterport, gathering that data, bringing it into a Revit or database-driven environment. And then you can see two rooms have been moved around and manipulated inside a Revit for just a remodel, small remodel area that's being done. This is definitely a great way to get started with your facilities and build it out over time. So we don't have to do all of it now. We don't have to have a full Revit database right away. We can build it out over time. Now, and what we do with that data after really becomes the important part of it. What is the end goal use? Are we going to leverage it in what I tend to call a digital twin? Right?
So that brings me to what I was wanting to make the point of this slide is you've heard me mention building information model or BIM. Has become kind of a marketing term. Now that is changing to, we hear digital twin. A lot of people think that they're the same thing. In my opinion, is they're really not the same thing. A building information model is essentially a design or constructability model. It could be, depending on the level of detail within it, a facilities model or an as-maintained model for operations and facilities. A digital twin is a model where we're actually using that data from an operations perspective for the facility. We're linking that data with multiple systems that we need to use to operate the facilities on that campus. So
in a real-time environment.
Yeah, IoT devices, door hardware, security devices, security camera. We're basically placing all this model data in the middle and interlinking it with the multiple different systems. So a digital twin has to have a physical copy that is actually operating. A building information model doesn't have to have a physical copy. It can just be a model out in space in a digital environment. But a digital twin really needs to be something in the real world matches this exactly.
Yeah, real-time people and asset tracking capability.
So when you hear the two terms, don't think of them interchangeably. At least I don't. I always think of a digital twin as something that is at a level of detail that has the data that somebody is consuming during the functions and facilities of their job. So that brings us to a tool called Autodesk Tandem, which is added this in. This is a data tool from Autodesk, but this is one of the directions that I wanted to talk about, that interoperability between different systems. So how are we going to move data and link data back and forth? You can do a direct read and write with some systems, but not necessarily all of them. So what Autodesk is coming up with is a tool called Tandem here Again, it's in beta, so it's not fully out in the world yet. But think of this as middleware that helps you classify and parse the model data, and it doesn't need to be an individual model. It can be multiple models together, that where you're doing that classification and just pushing the data that you need into an individual system. So what Tandem allows you to do is link all these data sources together as that middleware or that bridge, and only push what you need to into Archibus or into your IWMS or into your CMMS system, whatever that system happens to be. That's where Tandem is going to come in as the middleware, that basically that data bridge.
Being able to tie into your building systems monitoring software, being able to tie into potentially your security systems.
So that's kind of the next step, and also linking it. There's another tool out in the world that Esri just recently put out called GeoBIM, which is essentially taking the real world model data from multiple different data sources and georeferencing that and placing that within the Esri environment. You know, you think about what's the first query anyone ever does. It's where is it? You know, that's usually the first query. So the GIS systems have become really, this is the first place I look. Okay, where is it? Okay, here it is. Now I'm going into the building. So you start with those macro queries and go down into the micro queries. And you know, usually the macro queries involve some type of GIS system in a campus environment. So how does all this happen? Go back to my 3 questions. Understanding what data do you need, that is tied to your standards. So those are the key first things to start thinking about. And you know, then again, we move to how am I going to get it? How am I going to keep it up to date? But the little quote over on the corner from Winston Churchill is key in this place. You need to plan for this. It doesn't have to happen all at once. You don't need to do your entire campus, all millions of square feet at once. You can start this. I've worked on some of these projects where we've just done a floor of a building that was in a major renovation. We tested that out, determining that's how we figured out what data we wanted to do. I've done other ones where we've done just in capital projects, brand new builds. That's all we were going to do. We would put off all the older stuff until later, once we get all the new things done. So it really depends on, you know, your budget and your needs, where it makes sense to start. But a lot of the reasons that people don't do this is because they think of it in too large of context. They look at it in too large a scope. The trick is you know, pare that down a little bit and just get started. Brian?
Take that first step. Have a phased approach for it. So with